Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Darren Shan reread video. This one is going to be for Book 9, Killers of the Dawn. We reached the 3/4 way through the series with this. We end the third trilogy, the Vampire War trilogy, and we only have 3 books, one final trilogy to go. That's going to be very exciting when we get there, but first we have to deal with this very, very impactful book. So obviously, you come out of reading this one, and the main things to talk about are, of course, the 2 big things that happen right at the end. The death of Mr Krefsley and the reveal that Steve is the Lord of the Vampires. Now, one of these things was very, very obvious, and I think was maybe a little bit too heavily sort of foreshadowed and teased, or just the information was presented in a way where it was abundantly obvious that that was the case. So I don't really think that to the reader, Steve being the Lord of the Vampires is much of a reveal, but it is still impactful as a reveal to the characters because they don't experience the story in the same way as sort of we as the readers do, even though we follow their story. Because, you know, you sort of are analysing Steve and his return, and you know that there's other books to come. They don't. They feel any encounter could be the final encounter, even though we more or less know it is probably going to come down to the final encounter. So a few of the rules that are set up for the characters, they feel they can maneuver around. We sort of know they're going to play out in a certain way. And then there's other stuff, like I suppose the most obvious point in this book was when they see Debbie and she's brought out as the hostage, and she just out of nowhere says, don't trust them. They're listening to Steve and RV. Like Steve and RV are giving orders like behind the scenes that what's going on in front of her is different than the way they sort of structured themselves before the sort of hero characters got there, which to me makes it like very, very obvious that in the same way like Steve revealing that like he's done this whole plan and that a lot of the ideas are his, he's saying a little bit too much, and it's being very obvious that he is masterminding a lot of this, and it seems much more than just he happens to be allied with the Vampires and is intelligent, so they listen to him sometimes. The fact that he's borderline become a leader of sorts for them, it fits a bit too heavily. That plus the whole Mr. Tiny setup with a lot of the details of like they've only recently found him. He hasn't been blooded yet, obviously because of the age of the character and so on. The fact that a lot of the encounters that we've had so far, the actual Lord of the Vampires has been hooded, and we haven't really seen him. And then when he does speak here, he's just revealed to be, he looks like a normal guy. He says a few things that sort of come across like a ruler, but otherwise doesn't come across as anything particularly impressive. And the fact that he's killed without really displaying much skill also, heavily leans in that direction before the reveal actually comes out. The other thing is just because we ultimately know Mr. Tiny is manipulating a lot of things behind the scenes, you know that the hooded Lord of the Vampires isn't particularly important. It just feels a bit too obvious that he's not important, and that Steve is too important of a character to be in a position of like no note as just being a Vampires and not being a destined character in a way. And the way he is, obviously, he's just trying to sort of entertain himself. So this is why he has set it up so that he has Vanja and Gannon on either side, brother versus brother. It's why he has Steve involved in this versus like Darren and Mr. Krefsley on the other side. They're the key players in all of this. It's why RV also sort of plays a role in that, like, he is Mr. Destiny, basically. So, of course, he's playing on a lot of these personal dramas that, of course, these would be the main players. So, the unnamed, quote-unquote, Lord of the Vampires, of course, he doesn't really matter. So, just on that side of things, reading through it again, it was very obvious the second Steve was introduced, and especially once the betrayal happened quite early into his like debut book, basically, it felt very clear that this is the way they're going. He needs to do way more than just being a member of the bad guy team. So I thought that was fairly clear enough. The Death of Mr Krefsley, on the other hand, I thought was really, really well done. In terms of, he gets his big sort of solo fight in the same way that like already like Darren and Vanja have had their moments, because Steve is revealed to be the Lord of the Vampanese. The moment in the last book where Darren came this close to killing Steve and was only stopped by the threat against Debbie, that's like a missed opportunity, one of the destined opportunities missed. And obviously it kind of reveals that one of the previous opportunities wasn't maybe quite one of them from before. But, Vancha's missed an opportunity. Now Darren kind of missed an opportunity, and this is Mr. Krefsley's kind of missed opportunity. Meaning we're pretty much down to, like, there's one to go, and this is the big destined one to figure out who's going to be the Lord of Shadows, basically. So, we're getting down to it at this point, which is, really, really exciting. But Mr. Krefsley, 3-on-1, him versus Steve, the Lord of the Vampanese, and Ganon, while still being, injured, even though he had a little bit of a time to recover. Really impressive showing, and that's what they did well here. They got across. He is one of the best fighters in the series. That's been made abundantly clear. And he shows that in this fight by being able to defend against 3 relatively skilled opponents in a situation they've perfectly engineered to their advantage, an environment they know better than he does. And he sort of turns the tables on them here. I really like this. Of like, he knows he's probably going to die in this situation, and that the main aim he has throughout this fight is, I only have to focus on one of them. If I can kill the Lord of the Vampanese, that's all I need to do. As much as I would like to kill the other 2, I only really have to kill one, and that's what he does. The sequence of like him like dodging their kind of triple attack and doing like a handstand on the rail and like kind of backflipping over them, and then kind of like basically like suplex throwing the Lord of the Vampanese into the fiery spike pit. Such an incredible sequence, and you think like, wow, he's done it. Like, where does the series like go from here? Basically, you're not particularly sure. It's really, really interesting the path that is sort of taken after this, and that immediately, as there's like a little bit of a sort of like downtime, like you think the Vampanese should be like shocked that like they've lost. But Steve, of course, is just angry and just charges at Mr. Krefsley and tackles him into the pit. And a chapter ends with the idea of like he's plummeting to his doom, Mr. Krefsley, at the hands of Steve. And then the next chapter you go into is like, but suddenly out of nowhere, like Mika Verleth appears, the vampire prince Mika Verleth appears with the rest of the vampire army to save the day. Boom, Steve is killed. Boom, Ganon is killed. Victory. Mr. Krefsley and Darren reunite. The story's over. Let's go home. And then you end that chapter and go into the next chapter, and it's like, no, that's not what happened at all. Mr. Krefsley died. It was awful. It was terrible. He died much slower than the Lord of the Vampanese did, even though they, died in the same way. His death was, obviously later on we find out, in vain. But I thought this was a perfect way to get across that, like, this is one of the biggest, like, character deaths that is going to happen in this series. You had to get across that it's real, it's impactful, and it's one of the absolute main characters. That, okay, it's been, Darren is the main character. Steve in the first book was a secondary main character, and is now back to being a main character. But it was Mr. Krefsley. Mr. Krefsley has been the secondary sort of main character of the series for most of it up to now. And he has just been killed by Steve. And this has been set up very well. Steve's being so upset about being called evil in the past is ultimately what sets Steve on this path. That is what angered him so much to want revenge and turn him against even Darren, is ultimately being called evil by Mr. Krefsley, which he still takes offense at, even when it's brought up at the start of this book. He's still upset by that, which I find quite interesting, in that it highlights that obviously, like, you sort of care for Steve to a degree. Like, they even talk about it right at the start of the book, and what exactly that means. And for me, Darren tries to argue the point of just like, surely like no one can be truly evil. Like, it's just like a turn of phrase in a way, almost saying that he's evil. But Mr. Krefsley's like, no, I have enough experience to know that when I say someone like has evil blood, that they are destined to be evil. They can't make a choice to go against it. It's just going to happen. Sometimes this happens, that yes, good people can go bad, but people who start out with the potential for bad are always going to take that path. They can't turn away from it. And that's the path that they're setting Steve on now, that he can't go away from this. And the fact that he's now killed Mr. Krefsley and still believes that Darren like worked with Mr. Krefsley to make what happened in the first book happen tells you that he really has lost perspective on the situation. And he's even able to like act as a character who understands what Darren did, but ultimately he feels the opposite of that. And the extent, the lengths that he goes through of like manipulating the situation to research Darren, Mr. Krefsley, and Vanja, leak their information to get Darren put in school, and then call the police to get them thrown in prison, and then manipulate them being forced into the kind of cavern, the spike pit area where the final sequence happened. These last two books, it's just been Steve pulling the strings through years upon years of planning. That just shows the obsessive nature of this character. And Darren still just feels like, we were friends once. Like, how are you like this? Why can't you understand what actually happened? But that's the issue at play here. And the big question now is, okay, we've known for a few books at this point. Darren is one of the potential candidates to be the Lord or Master of Shadows, and the other one is the Lord of the Vampanese. So now it's either Darren or Steve. How's this going to work? There's going to be this final encounter. Will Darren be able to break through to his old friend, or is he going to finally have to accept that Steve is gone, basically, and attempt to kill him? That's a lot of the questions that we have going on here. But yeah, the Mr. Krefsley moment, that even in death may I be triumphant, is really, really fantastic. Overall, of just him taking out who he felt was Lord of the Vampanese, and then just the situation at play as like he's holding on to Steve's weapon and nearly is dragging everyone down with him. It really is a fantastic moment. But obviously they think they've won at that time, but then as they go to leave, they're going to like break off this situation here. We don't need to kill all the hunters. Let's just mess with them and subtly reveal it to them. Let's secretly tell Darren, knock him out, and while we're gone, they'll realize they haven't won. That they've not really accomplished anything. They just killed a random Vampanese. We've killed one of the hunters. We've made more progress than they have. And that's really impactful, of just Darren waking up and having to reveal to Vanja that, like, no, he died for nothing. Steve is the Lord of the Vampanese. The Lord of the Vampanese killed Mr. Krefsley. It's really brutal, and you're kind of wondering, like, going into the next book, how is this going to work? Because obviously we got the initial reaction of Darren here, but now as we go into obviously book 10, next time out, he's going to be dealing with the loss of the person he's sort of been closest to for the last, what is it, like 10 plus years basically of his life. This is a huge thing that's happened to Darren. But the mission now still has to go ahead, but they're down one hunter. Very, very impactful. But let's talk about some of the stuff from earlier on in the book. Because obviously, book 8, Darren goes to school. Book 9, Mr. Krefsley, Darren, and Harkat get put in prison. Like, they're basically held in a police station, and they're going to go to jail. And again, it's a situation manipulated by Steve. Obviously it happens because as they try to escape, Mr. Krefsley hurts his ankle. Vanja escapes holding the chief inspector, Alice, hostage. And obviously she comes back into play later on. Really, really interesting character, and I will get to her. But yeah, the scene in the police station is interesting because you see, I suppose, the different perspectives here of like the officers sort of like abandon following the law and don't give them all of their typical rights. But it's because they consider Mr. Krefsley, Darren, Harkat to be killers, because Steve ultimately frames them all for the deaths that the Vampanese have caused, like basically RV caused, in Mr. Krefsley's hometown. So there's a sort of double sort of tragedy to it there, of like Mr. Krefsley more or less being considered a criminal in his hometown, even though he's been trying to protect it and save it all this time. And again, like there's a few interesting moments. Like I actually really quite enjoyed the quite heavy conversation about the idea of just like, they show Darren pictures of what Vanja did to the vampet he tortured to get some of the information, and the fact that they killed him. And it's this interesting perspective of like Darren understands why that had to happen, because a lot of the humans just do not have any context of the war between vampires and Vampanese. They have no idea that it's being like manipulated by this godlike being, Mr. Tiny, what vampires are, if they're real, what Vampanese are, the difference between them, why this is happening. It's this secret war that most humans are utterly unaware of, that is of huge importance to our main characters, but to humans they just see chaos happening and that it's a crime. So I like the sort of nuance of that, of Darren questioning himself at times, but ultimately realizing that no, they don't know. I can't blame them for this. It does look bad for us, but we're doing what we have to do. So that was quite interesting. And then kind of like one of the bigger twists in the book, I thought, was that, there's a vampet working as one of the police officers here, and he allows Darren to escape. That Steve has manipulated this crazy string of incidents where he just wants to put Darren, Mr. Krefsley, Vanja, Harkat through hell before they get to the kind of final encounter. So they have to deal with the police, they have to deal with being out in the sunlight, deal with being in prison, and just having everyone turn against them. Like, he ruins their like reputations and has them looking like criminals to the world, basically, here. It is a huge mastermind plan, but it also shows the like obsessive nature of Steve, that he masterminded all of this to, he basically has, to a degree, sort of like almost like won by having them imprisoned, but he just uses that as like a temporary stage of his plan to eventually have them escape almost and look even worse, and then channel them to have the encounter in the caverns with the spike pit. Including, probably one of the more notable points is that the only places he has guarded is the tunnels underground, because he doesn't want them hiding from the sun. He wants Mr. Krefsley to have to experience the sun all the way up until they get to where they actually have to have the encounter. That is another kind of key moment. Darren's fine because he's still half vampire, but Mr. Krefsley suffers and he has to wear some sun cream, which is kind of a one slight moment of lightness in the middle of just craziness happening. But I suppose I'll talk about, Alice, and I suppose Debbie comes back into play as well. I suppose are the last things I need to talk about here. Alice I really like because, of course, she does the negotiations at the start, but then she gets held hostage by Vanja. And then she comes back into play when Vanja rejoins with everyone before we go into the final battle. And what I like here was that here is the character where we're going to get across that the vampires are on the good side of this. Vanja ultimately hasn't harmed her and has treated her as well as he could and has tried to explain the situation to her, even if it sounds crazy. And so in the situation she finds herself in, she's like, I guess I have to, use some of these weapons and try and fight with you. Otherwise, I don't know what's going on here. And then she realizes she's made the right choice as she goes through, and realizes that the people they're up against are utter madmen. Encountering RV first, and him taunting Darren about Debbie and hostage situations, that she suddenly realizes a lot of what they've been saying, which she's been ignoring because they're criminals, is actually true, that there are people worse than them out there. And especially when she sees Steve, and her impression as someone who's literally just met him is that he is out and out evil based on what he's saying and what he did. Because I almost forgot about this. One of the key moments that shows how twisted Steve is now is that he is in a perfect position in terms of like how he looks. He has just been saved from this hostage situation by the police intervening. But he breaks himself out and kills nurses and police officers on the way out when he really didn't need to do that. I'm sure the police officer Morgan could have gotten him out without any of that happening, but he just did it, showing that like Steve is cruel to the point where he's willing to kill innocent people, which is something Darren would never do. And that really shows that sort of change. And Alice sees that in him. And I love how the situation we get set up here is it's going to be Darren versus the Lord of the Vampires and Steve. Gannon makes this deal so as to avoid a lot of casualties, because of course the rule is only the Lord of the Vampires can kill the three hunters. So Darren is all set, the big brave moment here, final battle. He's going to go into it against all the odds. And it's a big brave moment for him, but Alice is actually the one who stops that from happening. Because when she sees her officer, Morgan, that he's on the other side and is just as bad as everyone else, she has her moment where she snaps, and this is what really like commits her to like the good guy team. And I really like this moment because you just see her like grab a gun, shoot him in the jaw, and it's a pretty grisly injury. And this just causes an out and out riot. All deals are off, and this is what gives the situation where, okay, Darren's 2-on-1 fight, official fight, hasn't happened, and Mr. Krefsley is put into the situation where he has to do the 3-on-1 fight. And just throughout it, like, she's firing shots all over the place. She actually hits the Lord of the Vampires in the arm with a shot, which was like another kind of crazy moment. Again, highlighting that the Lord of the Vampires doesn't seem particularly impressive, that he got hit by a stray bullet, but still. Just, you know, her getting to have some really cool, impressive, tough moments. And I believe she is in some of the other books, and she has a few more great moments, so that's nice to see. Debbie is probably the last character to talk about here. Obviously, she's been captured, but when she comes back into play and the deal is made that they're going to have the fight with Darren versus the 2-on-1 fight, she's reunited with Darren, and she does say that she loves him. So, obviously, the emotion of the situation, him coming back for her and negotiating for her, being willing to fight to get her back, it kind of makes her decision for her. She's obviously still likes Darren, they still have feelings for each other, but just Darren's sort of like age versus how he looks has been the one thing getting in the way. And that all sort of fades away at this point as she says what she says. And it feels like if this really did end at this point, this relationship was going to happen. And it still, you know, has the potential to happen, but they're just in the middle of a lot of crazy stuff happening right now. So it's not really the time for a relationship, but if everything goes well and both survive this war, it feels like this relationship can happen. So I definitely like that, of like we got over that kind of hurdle that was there. And just like the true honesty of her feelings kind of comes out at this point. And as well as that, I like that the book sort of explored this, just the idea of, okay, Darren, we know you're going to like care very heavily about Debbie going into this final fight, but you have to make it so that you won't be controlled by just what they do to her. So it was a kind of big moment where when he finally confronts RV, he's able to be like, no, I won't do what you say just because you have Debbie held captive. And ultimately, RV is kind of like, oh, I thought I'd be able to control you, but they told me you'd eventually come around and not be controlled by us holding her hostage. But she still plays like a role kind of, you know, as the hostage, but you see the strength of the character of just that, like, he cares, but he won't let himself be controlled by that anymore. So it's just, you know, it was a nice slight twist on that typical situation of just the hero is utterly helpless just because they have someone he cares about held hostage. It was a nice way to sort of get around that and not have to kill Debbie off or anything like that. So that was pretty cool. I also like that in the middle of all the fighting here, like Harkat basically just beat RV, got his hook hands off, but RV is still, he's going to be back, of course, as we see. But I think that's most of what I want to talk about in this one. Obviously, the big moments at the end. The death of Mr. Krefsley is a huge moment, really well done. Even though it's been pretty obvious Steve is the Lord of the Vampires, seeing the characters react to the reveal is still impactful, even though it was kind of obvious to us as readers. And then a lot of the build-up to it, just I didn't realize just how much of a mastermind plan when I read it years and years ago it was from Steve. The connection of like book 8 into book 9 and how, yeah, Steve did all of this basically, engineering this, was crazy. And so he gets his big victory at this point in the story. And the question is going to be now, Darren has still sort of held out hope that there's still something in Steve. Is he going to be able to just actually try to kill Steve next time out? I think at this point everyone is just done with him. They are going for the jugular when they see him again. And it was a great way to just make you also, as the audience, double down on, yeah, Steve is gone. There's no hope for him left. And you just view him as the Lord of the Vampires who needs to be taken out. So, yeah, next week we go into the longest book in the series, The Lake of Souls. Very excited to go back to this one and cover some more Harkat-focused stuff here. But that has been the video. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.